Hello and welcome back to the virtual classroom. I'm your host, Dr. Olmsted. As you see, today's topic is World War II, specifically abroad. Now, before we begin, as always, take a moment, hit pause on this video, jot down the lecture outline to your right, and pay particular attention to those key terms at your left. Be able to identify the who, what, where, when, why, be able to connect them to each other, and of course, their larger historical significance. You got it? Let's get started. So we left off talking about FDR and his New Deal. And most Americans were, while most Americans were primarily concerned about ending the Depression during the 1930s, foreign affairs were quite far from the minds of average Americans. But remember, the Depression is not simply a U.S. issue. The Depression is worldwide. Because worldwide economies are intertwined by this point in history. And America was far from alone in dealing with the Depression. The New Deal was FDR's response to the Depression. But remember, he rejected any call to assume dictator power. But elsewhere in the world, the Depression would help facilitate a rise in totalitarian governments and dictatorships. Take Italy, which would see the rise of fascism. So in Italy, Benito Mussolini had seized power back in 1922. A World War I veteran himself, when he returns, he organizes a fascist movement. Now, fascism is a far right-wing movement that is a hybrid of nationalism and socialism. And it's hyper-nationalism to the point where you can't criticize any part of the countries, the past, the government, anything. Because the state is above all. The nation is above all. He promised to restore order and national pride, and he found wide appeal. Now, once in power, he would suppress any political opposition. And by 1925, he had become a dictator. And when the Depression hits, it's only mild in Italy compared to elsewhere because he was already conducting large public works projects and rebuilding the military through his fascist dictatorship. Consider, of course, Germany, which is, of course, is going to be very important in World War II. Germany, too, was struggling to deal with the Depression. But we have to go back to World War I to understand Germany's change here. See, back in 1919, the democratic Weimar Republic had ruled Germany. So post-World War I, they had instituted a democratic government in Germany. But the government was pretty ineffective dealing with the Depression. Things were so bad in Germany that at one point they were burning the cash, the paper money, for fire and heat. Because of hyperinflation, it was worth nothing. It was actually worth more as fuel for fire. But of course, what makes things really worse in Germany was those war reparations. Remember, Germany had been saddled with billions of dollars of war reparations through the Treaty of Versailles that ended World War I. These war debts would shackle Germany and their economy even more, allowing an opening for a dictator who said all the right things to gain support of the German people. Of course, enter Adolf Hitler and his, in name, National Socialist Party, the Nazi Party. But remember, this is a fascist organization. They were not socialist. He would assume power as chancellor in 1933. To put it in U.S. perspective, kind of like he would be the Senate Majority Leader or the House Leader, who would basically be next in line for the president should the president and vice president die, right? That's kind of his position. Again, trying to put it in U.S. terms. But then when the German president dies, he will assume dictator powers in 1934. This was a desperate time for Germany. And Hitler would capitalize on German frustration and anger. Now, there's a whole lot more to the story, and I wish we could spend a whole semester on Nazi Germany and the Holocaust. I've done it. But short version is in 1934, he's able to merge the office of the chancellor and the president, and he will become unquestioned Führer, dictator. What he does next, though, however, is very popular among the German people. He pulls out of the League of Nations. He begins to rearm Germany in defiance of the Treaty of Versailles. He will establish a secret Nazi police state. He will find convenient scapegoats for Germany's problems, persecuting leftists, homosexuals, gypsies, and of course, Jews. But to be clear, within just 3 years, Germany is out of the Depression. Thanks to rebuilding the military and large public works projects like Volkswagen. That was a Nazi creation. The Autobahn, one of the most famous highways in the world. By the time the 1936 Olympics comes around, Germany was on full display. And Nazism was looking pretty good. And yes, there was a Nazi party in the United States. They would hold rallies throughout the country. Or take the Japanese. Just like the United States in the late 19th century, the Japanese had imperialist visions of grandeur. They wanted to control colonies beyond its borders. Under Emperor Hirohito, Japan's industrialization and modernization became very rapid. Beginning in the 1860s, by the time World War II came around, Japan was a legitimate world power. The militarist government would set their eyes on China and its raw materials and markets. By 1931, Japanese agents staged an explosion of a rail line in the Chinese province of Manchuria, northern China. And Japan used that as a way to say, hey, instability. And they used it as a pretext to military occupy the province. Now, there are a few things that unify all of these regimes. These are all, whether it's fascism in Italy, whether it's Nazism in Germany, or militarism in Japan, they are all dictatorships that inspire extreme hyper-nationalism, hyper-patriotism to the point where you can't see any faults. All of them were able to get their nations or minimize the effects of the Depression by large public works projects and militarism, building the military. And because they were all militaristic, they also needed one more thing: to expand. Because if you're spending all this money on military and not using it, you will die as a nationalist nation. So they all need to expand, and war is one way to do that. And so what we find here are these regimes, right? Whether it is going to be, fascism, Nazism, militarized totalitarianism, these are all far right-leaning dictatorships. You see on the pendulum on the timeline on your screen. On the far left, of course, is anarchy, followed by communism, which was at that point the Soviet Union only. And then you have socialism. Then you see at the bottom the way we in the United States kind of fall. And again, this kind of changes over time, and we'll get to this point when we get to the 1980s, 1990s. But what we find here is that in the United States, we are far more moderate in general, even though we are much more right-leaning now. And what you see is kind of the definition where on the far left, they believe in redistribution of wealth, safety nets, worker rights. And so you can see where the New Deal did some of that, right? Some workers' rights, the Wagner Act, social safety net, things like the Social Security Act. But at the same time, though, we notice that FDR did not dismantle and redistribute wealth in the nation. That did not happen. So you're not talking here socialism or even communism. At the same time, we in the United States also have the free market system, which FDR did largely keep intact. And so despite complaints lobbied at him, FDR was not a far left-leaning communist or dictator. Nonetheless, though, World War II is finally going to begin. And while technically you could say it starts 1931 with Manchuria, it really begins in 1937 when Japan wants to now take mainland China. So they got Manchuria, occupied that for 6 years. But now they wanted to set their sights on China itself. And in 1937, they will enter the Japanese capital of Nanking. This becomes known as the Rape of Nanking in December of 1937, as it led to a massacre, a 6-week period starting from the day that the Japanese captured Nanking, the Chinese capital. Over 300,000 Chinese civilians and disarmed combatants were murdered by soldiers of the Imperial Japanese Army. There will be widespread rape and widespread looting. That was on the world stage considered horrific. But as most of the nations of the world are still dealing with the Depression, everyone turned a blind eye. But the result for Japan was a very enlarged Japanese empire. Now, back in Europe, however, by 1937, Hitler was also on the move. Now, remember, after World War I, neither France nor Great Britain wanted to get into another war. And the result of this was that they began a policy of what's called appeasement, when Hitler began to move and take new nations. So Hitler pulls out of the League of Nations. He repudiates the Treaty of Versailles by refusing to pay war reparations, and he begins to rebuild his military. They did nothing. Then Hitler will annex Austria, a former territory of Germany during World War I. Lots of Germans there, and it was where Hitler was from. The Allies, Britain and France, said, "You can't do that, Hitler." But Hitler said, "Sorry." They really want to be part of Germany again. And so the Allies replied, "Okay, fine, Hitler, but no more. You promise?" Hitler's like, "I promise." And then the following year, Hitler would invade part of Czechoslovakia. And the conversation would repeat itself with a "bad Hitler, bad." And Hitler says, "Hey, they wanted my help. I'm just doing them a favor." Finally, in 1939, Hitler was going to invade Poland to acquire more land and to what was known as Lebensraum, living space. He wanted more land. Again, it's kind of the German version of Manifest Destiny. Hitler believed that it was his destiny to create Lebensraum, living space for Germans to expand. So he would invade Poland to acquire more land and food to feed his people, officially beginning World War II. And of course, all this is taking place. Mussolini is going to go into Ethiopia and take Ethiopia, and fascism begins to spread into places like Spain under Francisco Franco. So all of this is going on. You have both Hitler and Mussolini expanding, taking territory. Spain has now fallen to fascism, and Japan is taken into Japan is taken into China and expanded into the Pacific Ocean. In response, the United States once again declares neutrality, and they really mean it this time. They would even pass neutrality acts that would prevent the United States from selling any war armaments to any warring nations. Why? Remember World War I's insinuation that was all to help out Wall Street bankers like J.P. Morgan? Yeah. Well, in 1934 to 1936, FDR set up the Nye Committee that conducted 93 hearings and questioned more than 200 witnesses. And the committee documented the huge profits that armament factories had made during World War I. It found that bankers had indeed pressured Woodrow Wilson to intervene in the war to protect their loans abroad. They did not want to repeat. And so as the years of war passed, FDR stayed out of the war, but he did begin to prepare, began to slowly build back up the military, and would initiate a peacetime draft. So let's flash forward to 1941. 1941, France has fallen, half it has fallen. Hitler has taken most of Western Europe, and Britain is being bombed. The US is going to place a full embargo on Japan for their continued hostility to our friend, suddenly, China. And of course, on December 7th, 1941, which ironically is the day I'm recording this, December 7th, the Japanese are going to attack Pearl Harbor, in large part to try to force the United States to lift the oil embargo, at least negotiate. And so very famously on the morning of December 7th, 1941, Sunday morning, just at dawn, the Japanese send in their bombers and attack our ships in Pearl Harbor. On December 8th, FDR would deliver an address to Congress declaring December 7th a date which shall live in infamy, asking for a declaration of war. Congress would pass the war resolution almost unanimously with only one dissenter, who was a pacifist, Jeanette Rankin, who would refuse to vote for war under any condition. Now, unlike World War I, mobilizing for war was much easier this time. FDR had already been preparing, and the assembly line process was in full use, making all industries. It was in use in all industries, making it far quicker and easier for private industries to switch over to producing war materials. In addition, the Pearl Harbor attack made this war popular, as millions would volunteer to serve their country. In total, more than 16 million men and women would serve. Now, let's talk about Mexican Americans here for a moment. Remember, on the eve of World War II, the New Deal, for all of its benefits, had not ended the Depression. And Mexicanos, especially them along with African Americans, were still heavily suffering. Most were still living in predominantly rural areas. The poverty was still enduring. They lived with entrenched segregation. Juan Crow was still alive and well. They suffered inadequate health care, little to no educational opportunities, and suffered in housing discrimination. But Mexican Americans saw World War II as an opportunity, and thousands, an estimated 400,000 to 500,000 Mexican Americans would serve in the military. In fact, it was proportionally speaking, Latino enlistment rates were higher among Mexican Americans compared to other groups. In proportion to a total Latino population of about 2 million people, somewhere around 400,000 to 500,000 would enlist. A substantial amount, a substantial number of Mexican Americans are going to serve. Now, several factors to consider when discussing why they participated. Many are volunteering because they are convinced what FDR was convinced, that democracy was in trouble. FDR had pitched the war to America as America becoming the great arsenal of democracy. Many would receive draft notices, as you see on your screen. The vast majority of draftees are poor, uneducated, blue-collar workers or unemployed. They were also victims of inequitable draft practices because there were no Mexicanos or Latinos on draft boards. They were denied educational deferments, which led to higher induction rates. Mexico's government also encouraged Mexican nationals in the United States to join the armed services and to contribute to the war efforts, as many did. Ultimately, military service was also steady pay, which was crucially important to a group that was suffering still tremendously during the Depression years. Now, a big surprise, the largest number of troops for Mexican Americans came from Texas, which also had the highest casualty and death rates. Let's be very clear. Even if a Mexican American wanted to join, to volunteer, there was always still room for racism and discrimination. There are numerous men who spent and experienced issues trying to serve their country. Take Francisco Vega, nicknamed Pancho. Again, affectionately named Pancho Vega. He was a military man who would storm the beaches at Normandy on D-Day. A hero. He was born in San Antonio in 1922. He was enrolled in ROTC school. So a military type, upbringing in that vein. At school, however, the faculty forcibly changed his name. They wanted his name Francisco to sound more American, more anglicized, more English. Now, logically, I do this in class every year. I always say, so what do you think his name should be? And of course, every student will automatically say, Frank. His name is Francisco. Make it Frank. It makes sense. Now, the school chose Mike. So going through ROTC school, his name was Mike Vega. And so while many Army mates would nickname him Pancho, affectionately so, his superiors in school and later in the service would know him as Mike Vega. Now, after hearing the bombing of Pearl Harbor on December 7th, Vega's brother called him from Mexico and told him, quote, "Your country has just been attacked. You need to go and volunteer and not wait," unquote. Until the next day, Vega would go and try to enlist to volunteer, but was told, quote, "We're not taking Mexicans right now," unquote. This is war, and yet he's trying to volunteer and being denied. In fact, he would go back numerous times over the next year, and it would not be until October of 1942 that he would finally be accepted. And this is a dude who grew up in ROTC school. Now, in his interview, he cited his darker complexion. He had darker brown skin as the reason he was rejected, as he knew other lighter-skinned Mexicanos in San Antonio who were accepted before him. Or take Martin Morales, who, while on leave from the Air Force in full uniform, was denied service at a Dallas restaurant. The owner told him that he was not permitted to eat in the dining area, that if he wanted food, he would have to order the counter and eat in the kitchen. So again, despite serving disproportionately larger numbers compared to their overall population, despite serving bravely in the military, that we'll talk about in a few minutes even more, there's still rampant discrimination, segregated units, discrimination at home. But we'll talk more about heroism in the second half of this lecture. So until then, take care and bye-bye.